Hello everyone, welcome back to Making Art with Mrs. Gordon. Today we will be making a Zentangle landscape. So let's use patterns and designs to create this beautiful space. First thing you'll need is a clean white sheet of paper. I'm using a smaller sheet of paper just to save on time. You can use a regular sheet of paper that you have at home. You'll also need a pencil and an eraser because most likely you will be erasing. And if you have it at home, use a black Sharpie marker. So I have actually two here. These are the exact same. I have two different styles. I have this regular black Sharpie fine point marker. And then I have another black Sharpie marker, but it's more like a Sharpie pen and it has a finer point to it. So this one is great for small detail. This one is great for a little bit larger detail, thicker lines. I'm gonna actually make my Zentangle completely black and white. So it's up to you if you want yours to also be that way, or you can use color. So if you have your own Sharpies or your own markers at home, you can use colors or just your black regular marker. If you have Crayola markers, any type of markers like that. If you don't have markers at all, that's perfectly fine. You can still create this with crayons or colored pencils. It's totally up to you. So please use whatever you may have at home. Also, if you have a ruler, that will be really handy for this too. For patterns and designs that are straight lines, so you don't have to kind of wing it. You have something to make sure it's straight. And if you don't have a ruler at home, something with a straight edge like a book, a folder would be perfect, and it would still make those same straight lines. All right, so let's get started. So first I want to give you a little bit of background about landscapes and what a Zentangle is, so we are familiar before we dive in. So first thing is a landscape. Landscape is an area outdoors, right? And that can look different in different places. So if you live in Chicago, the landscape is different on different sides of the city. So if you are downtown, you get lots of skyscrapers. You might have lots of cars, lots of streets, maybe even the lake in your view. But if you live somewhere maybe south, far south, or maybe west or east, you get lots of houses, lots of apartment buildings. You don't get really tall skyscrapers like you do downtown. And if you live in the suburbs, you get a lot larger open areas. You might see more grass. You might see fencing and animals. And the further out you get, further away from Chicago, you go south and you go really far out, you might see farms and things like that, hills and mountains, the further away you get from Illinois. So landscapes can look different in different places. So just keep that in mind when you draw your landscape today. So you can draw any type of landscape. I'm going to do more of a hill and mountainy type landscape just to keep it simple, but feel free to put anything that's outdoors in your landscape. To create a landscape, we have to keep three things in mind. There are three parts to a landscape. First part to a landscape, or those three parts are the foreground, middle ground, and the background. Foreground is the area that is closest to you and the largest. Middle ground, or it's perceived to be the largest. The middle ground is slightly smaller than the foreground and it's further away. And then the background is furthest away and usually perceived to be the smallest. Now, for example, if you've ever walked down the street, you might notice if you look down a street, the houses, the people, the cars, the further away they get from you, they start to feel smaller, right? But we know in reality, they don't actually shrink. It's just the perspective. As they get further away from us, they start to look smaller. So to make an accurate landscape, we want to make sure everything we draw at the bottom of our paper, which is in our foreground, that we keep that the largest. And as we work our way up the paper through our middle ground and our background, we want things to start to shrink. Only thing that may not follow that rule of thumb is things like the sun or the moon, because they are actually very large, and depending on because they're so large, they don't always follow the rules of foreground, middle ground, background. So don't worry about your sun being super tiny like a star, but the rest of your eye, or like clouds, you know, some clouds can look really big even though they're super far away. Just keep in mind things like your roads, your hills, your buildings, things like that. If you draw a stop sign or cars, those things have to follow the rule of largest in the foreground and then smaller as it works its way up through the middle ground and background. So I hope that makes sense. I'll explain zentangles a little later in the video once we get to that portion. So right now you should have your paper and your pencil. That is what we're going to work with first. And we're going to start putting down our landscape. Like I said before, I really want my landscape to be hills, mountains, and maybe a sun and clouds. So I'm going to start with hills at the bottom in my foreground. And remember, because it's in my foreground, it's the largest, right? So at the bottom of my paper, I'm going to draw large hills. And I want them to overlap one another, kind of one behind the next. And as I work my way up, I want to make sure those hills start to not only narrow in size, but shrink down, become a little bit shorter. So you notice how tall these are, but these are getting shorter, and I want them to continue to do that and even get more narrow as we work our way up the paper. And you really want to just kind of repeat that. I might do a little bit more. Okay. I think I'm satisfied with that. My next step, now that I have my hills, and notice that they start large and they start to gradually get smaller as I work my way into my middle ground. Now that I'm in my middle ground, the middle of your paper, I'm going to start putting in my mountains. They can't be super large because they're in the middle ground, so I want to make sure they stay moderately medium in size compared to the hills that are also in my middle ground. So just draw a few mountains. And I'm going to just draw as many as I feel like. And I'm just kind of moving my pencil around to kind of create this wavy or zigzag, jagged type of line. There's no real rule or how you have to do this. But just keep in mind you don't want them to be super large if you're putting them in your middle ground, because you want them to still follow that rule of thumb that the others are. Okay. And I think I'm satisfied with that. I think I'll just do 4. From this point, our next step is to do our sun and our clouds. So at the top, now we are working from our middle ground into our background. And again, the sun doesn't have to follow the rule of thumb, so you can make it as large as you would like. So first, I think I'll draw my sun. And you know, for a sun, you're just drawing a circle. And this doesn't have to be a sun on your paper. This could be the moon. It's up to you. Once I have my sun, my next step is to put in some clouds. Now I don't want really fluffy clouds, so I'm going to kind of use a wavy line to make some thin, kind of stretched out clouds. So I'm going to use a wavy line and really softly create my clouds. You know, they're really thin, they're stretched out. The ones down here I'm going to make the largest, but as I go further to the top of my paper, I'm going to make them a little smaller. The clouds are going to follow that rule of thumb. Larger here, but as I go up the paper, they'll be smaller. I even think I want one kind of covering my sun a bit. And then I can just erase the part that's showing through the cloud. Then my last, I think I'll put a few more up here. Again, I'm going to make these the smallest just to follow that rule of thumb. Maybe one more up here. I think I could use one down here. What do you guys think? I think so. All right, so our next step, just make sure I have everything that's drawn. Gonna look at it for a second. All right, I think I'm satisfied. Hope you guys are too with yours. Our very next step, we are going to start tracing all of the hills, all of the mountains, clouds, and the sun with a Sharpie marker. Again, if you don't have a Sharpie or a marker, you can use colored pencils. I do recommend tracing it just so you can distinguish each object from the next. I'm going to use my Sharpie fine point marker, which gives me thicker lines, and I'll outline everything in this thicker line. So I'll do that really quick, and then I will explain Zentangles next. So all done tracing. So our next step, that was pretty simple, right? We drew our landscape, we traced everything with a Sharpie or whatever you may have at home. My next step is to put in my Zentangles. I'm going to explain a little bit what that is. Zentangles is basically an art form where you use patterns and designs to fill up your entire space. So instead of coloring your traditional way, and all those patterns and designs kind of put together create a very unified or harmonious image. So it looks really nice together. You would think different patterns would be chaotic, but in a Zentangle, the way it is, the way they're meshed together, it actually works really well and creates a very finished, beautiful, unified image. When you are creating a Zentangle, you can use truly any pattern or design that you want. Keep in mind though, if you choose to repeat any patterns in a different area, so for example, if I create a pattern here in this bottom heel, if I want to repeat that pattern again in my image, I recommend you repeat it far away from where you did the first pattern. So for example, if I put a pattern here and then I want to use that pattern again, I shouldn't use it right next to it because it'll make all of this piece feel like one piece. You want to make sure when you create a pattern here, you do a different one there, a different one here, so you can distinguish between each object. When I repeat that pattern, maybe if I have it here, I'll repeat it up here in the mountains instead, so it's nice and far away and I can still distinguish between each item on my image. Okay, hope that makes sense. So you don't have to come up with 1,000 patterns, just make sure you don't repeat them right next to each other. And I'll be actually going back and forth between these two markers because for finer details, I'm going to want to use this thin Sharpie pen versus my Sharpie fine point marker. All right, so I'm going to jump right in. I'm going to be using patterns like lines, shapes, and I'm going to I'm not sure if I'm going to use numbers or letters, but I'm going to really stick to lines, different types of lines like straight, zigzag, curly, swirl, and then shapes like circle, square, things like that throughout my image. So you can go ahead and watch, and I might pause here and there to say anything. I'm not sure as of yet, but feel free to watch and then create your own patterns or use the ones that you see on the video today. Alrighty. Stop here for 1 second because I just thought of something I did not mention. Some of you may feel really confident to go in with your marker or your colored pencil and dive right into your patterns. And you might say, I know exactly what I want to do, so I'm not worried about any mistakes. But some of you might feel really nervous about doing that. I recommend, if you don't feel confident about jumping right in with your marker, your colored pencil, whatever medium you're using, feel free not to. You don't have to do that. You can start off with your pencil first, right? You can start off with your pencil and draw your patterns, and then you can go back with your marker, your colored pencil, crayon, and you can trace over it. Just like we did when we created our landscape, we drew with pencil first and then we traced with our marker. So don't feel obligated to start off with marker like I'm doing. Feel free to start with pencil and then go back and use whatever medium, coloring medium that you're going to be using on top of that pencil. So this is my completed Zentangle. When you are done, feel free, if you did marker, you might have some areas where you might have a little pencil showing. You want to give it a minute or two to dry before you actually start to erase, but just make sure it's dry. And if you have any markings where you might see a little bit of pencil showing, I specifically see that like on my son because I sketched that a little bit more than other things. I want to kind of get rid of those lines, and I'm just looking at my heels, see a few areas where I can clean up a bit. So you might want to go back and just take a quick look if you use like a black Sharpie or a marker at all, and see if there's any areas of the pencil where the pencil's still showing you don't really want it to show. Okay, I think that's sufficient. So just keep in mind, whenever you create a landscape, you want to have those three areas: foreground, middle ground, and your background. Everything in the foreground starts the largest, and as it works its way up the paper, it gradually gets smaller, giving the illusion that things are going further and further away. I hope you really enjoyed this video. Please make sure to like, subscribe, share with those you think really will like it, and please come back again. I upload usually on the weekly basis, but I am a teacher, so sometimes it gets a bit difficult, but I upload as much as possible. So please take a look at any other videos. I have a ton of content for you to enjoy. Thank you so much. And before we go, we want to make sure we do sign our work. So I'm going to grab my pen. I'm going to sign our work in the bottom right hand corner because we want to take credit for our beautiful designs. And And I want to just thank you so much for making art with Mrs. Gordon.